The Great Flood, a myth shared by many cultures. 1. Definition of the Great Flood. The Great Flood is an intriguing concept that appears in many cultures around the world, functioning as a mythical account that narrates a great flood capable of exterminating humanity, except for a small group of survivors. This narrative, besides being fascinating, leads us to reflect on the relationship between human beings and the forces of nature. In many traditions, the flood is seen as a divine response to the actions of humanity, a way of purifying the earth of its corruption and evil. When I think about the Great Flood, I realize that it touches on deep themes that resonate with our own life experience. We all face moments of crisis, where we feel that everything around us is falling apart. The Great Flood, with its powerful imagery of destruction and renewal, reminds us that even in the darkest times, there can be an opportunity for rebirth and transformation. It's as if this ancient story is telling us that after the storm, there will always be a rainbow, a promise of a new beginning. The concept of a flood that wipes out all life is so powerful that we cannot ignore its implications. It forces us to look at our actions and their consequences. The earth, in its wisdom, has its limits. When we go beyond those limits, we face the consequences. This leads us to an important conversation about how we are treating our planet today, don't you think? Historically, the flood is mentioned in sacred texts and myths of ancient civilizations, such as the Bible, where the story of Noah is perhaps the most famous. But what really fascinates me is that this narrative is not exclusive to Judaism or Christianity. It appears in many cultures, such as the story of Gilgamesh, and which also speaks of a great flood. This global presence suggests that, in some way, all peoples have a collective memory of natural catastrophes that have marked their existence. Brachur 2. Global presence. The idea of the Great Flood is fascinating and extends across cultures around the world. When we talk about this topic, it is interesting to note that civilizations as diverse as Mesopotamia, Hinduism, Greece, and Native America have their own versions of this myth. This leads us to reflect on what may have originated this shared narrative. The global presence of the flood suggests that, at some point in history, a catastrophic event impacted several communities. Many of these cultures may have faced severe flooding, perhaps due to climate change, melting glaciers, or other natural factors. In this way, the Great Flood can be seen as a collective response to traumatic experiences that shaped the worldview of our ancestors. Personally, I have always been impressed by the way these stories intertwine, even if the details vary. The story of Noah, for example, is well known in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but it is not unique. In Mesopotamian mythology, we have the story of Utnapishtim, who is also chosen by a deity to survive a great flood. This makes me think about how humanity, over the centuries, has sought to understand and explain the forces of nature and the fragility of life. In addition, each story brings with it an important lesson. The presence of the flood in different cultures can symbolize humanity's struggle against forces that are beyond our control. This struggle is a constant in history, something that we all face in some way in our lives. The idea that, after the flood, it is possible to start over and rebuild is a theme that resonates deeply with many of us, especially when we look at the challenges we face in our daily lives. Another aspect that deserves to be highlighted is the way in which these narratives reflect the morals and values of the societies that created them. The presence of a main character, often a just man, indicates the search for virtue amid corruption and despair. This leads us to ask, what does it mean to be just in a world that, at times, seems to be drowning in injustice? This question is as relevant today as it was millennia ago. 3. Varied versions. The theme of the Great Flood is fascinating because of its many versions that permeate different cultures and religions. If we stop to think about it, each account brings with it not only a narrative, but also a set of values, beliefs, and lessons that reflect the society in which it originated. It is interesting to note that, despite the differences, many of these accounts share fundamental elements that help us understand what these societies considered important. Let's explore this together. In many traditions, we find the figure of a central hero, often a righteous man, who is chosen to survive this great catastrophe. For example, in the biblical narrative, we have Noah, who is instructed by God to build an ark and save his family and a pair of each animal species. In Mesopotamian mythology, we find Utnapishtim, who also receives this divine mission in response to the corruption of humanity. It is interesting to note how these figures, despite their different origins, carry morality and virtue as essential characteristics. For me, this makes us reflect on the importance of ethics and justice in times of crisis. Another interesting point is the construction of boats for survival. This idea of a refuge is not only literal, it symbolizes hope in the midst of chaos. Noah's Ark and Utnapishtim's boat are not just boats. They are representations of the shelter we all seek in times of difficulty. In life, we often face storms, and just like these characters, we need a safe space where we can protect ourselves and find a new beginning. Think about your own life. How many times have you needed emotional or physical shelter? Rosubars. Reasons for the flood. The reasons for the occurrence of the universal flood are fascinating and reflect deep concerns about the human condition. Throughout history, various cultures have reported that the decision to cause a catastrophic flood was linked to divine wrath. This concept of a superior being dissatisfied with humanity is a recurring theme, and it is not difficult to understand why. In many accounts, corruption, violence, and evil became so prevalent that, according to the narratives, the divine was left with only one option: to purify the earth. When I read these stories, I reflect on the responsibility that each of us carries. Are we not, in a way, repeating the mistakes of the past? Society often finds itself embroiled in petty disputes, excessive materialism, and a lack of empathy. The flood serves as a wake-up call, a reminder that our actions have consequences. It is almost as if the messages conveyed by these ancient narratives are echoing through the centuries, asking us to look within and seek a more harmonious path. The reasons for divine wrath, according to these stories, often focus on behaviors that harm the essence of human coexistence. Corruption and evil are often seen as social ills that, if left untreated, can lead to devastating results. For example, the biblical story of Noah emphasizes the moral degeneration of humanity to the point that God decides to start over. This concept of a new beginning highlights the importance of reflection and change. After all, personal and collective transformation is always possible, no matter how bleak the circumstances may seem. 5. Survivors. Accounts of the Great Flood often focus on a select group of individuals who escape the catastrophe. These survivors are not just random figures. They represent hope, continuity, and the possibility of a new beginning. I think that by looking at these stories, we can find a reflection of our own lives, where we face storms and challenges, but always with the possibility of rebirth. In many of these myths, the survivors are chosen for their virtues. For example, in the biblical narrative, Noah is seen as a righteous man whose faithfulness and righteousness make him worthy of saving his family and a pair of every animal species. This choice is not merely random. It emphasizes the need for character and morality in times of crisis. The message we can draw here is powerful. Even in times of great despair, integrity and goodness can protect us. In addition, the figure of the survivor often serves as an example to be followed. In stories from many cultures, those who escape the flood not only survive, but are also tasked with a mission to rebuild the world. This idea resonates deeply with us, because at some point, we have all felt responsible for rising from the fall. The challenge for each of us is to know how to take the experiences that shape us and use them to create something new and better. Another interesting aspect of survivors is the diversity of their experiences. While some myths speak of a single survivor, others highlight families or groups. For example, in Mesopotamian mythology, the story of Utnapishtim involves not only him, but also his wife and others who were saved. This suggests that survival is often a collective experience. When we are facing hardships, it is vital to remember that we are not alone. There is a support network around us, and together we can face adversity. Symbolism. The Great Flood is not just a story of destruction, but carries deep meanings that resonate across different cultures and historical periods. When we talk about symbolism, we come across concepts of purification, ion, renewal, and a new beginning. These ideas are universal and offer a powerful reflection on the human condition. Purification, for example, is a recurring theme. Water, in many spiritual traditions, is seen as an element that cleanses. Think of bathing rituals or renewal ceremonies. Water is used to ward off negative energies and bring about a new beginning. The flood, in this sense, can be interpreted as a great purification ritual, where humanity is called to leave behind its faults and mistakes. By surviving this great flood, the survivors not only escape destruction, but also receive the opportunity to start over with a new perspective and renewed values. Renewal is another essential aspect. After a great catastrophe, such as a flood, the land is often portrayed as fertile, ready to be cultivated again. This aspect teaches us that, even after the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of a new beginning. It is like in life, we often face difficulties that seem insurmountable, but human resilience allows us to rise up and flourish again. This idea of rebirth is something we should carry with us, especially in times of crisis. In addition, the symbolism of the flood also touches on the concept of collectivity. Myths often mention the survival of a select group, which represents not only the continuity of humanity, but also the importance of unity and solidarity. In times of adversity, collaboration and mutual support are essential. At this point, I remember situations in which the community came together to overcome challenges. These experiences show that, instead of facing difficulties alone, we should seek connection and help from others. De Sam. 7. Archaeological interpretations. Archaeological interpretations of the Great Flood are far from being just an academic exercise. They invite us to reflect on the relationship between humanity and the natural disasters that shaped our history. With each new excavation, with each new discovery, it becomes more evident that many accounts of catastrophic floods may have real roots, connecting them to events that actually occurred in times past. When it comes to archaeological interpretations, it is essential to understand that archaeology is not just about ancient artifacts or ruins. It is also a window into understanding the fears, hopes, and experiences of our ancestors. For example, in regions such as Mesopotamia, there is evidence of floods that could have inspired the stories we know today. Ancient cities such as Ur and Babylon faced great floods from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which certainly had a profound impact on the lives of the people who lived there. These floods were not just natural phenomena. They represented challenges that forced entire communities to restructure themselves. It is fascinating to think that this struggle for survival may have been transformed into narratives that have endured for millennia. Throughout history, these collective experiences have been reinterpreted and passed on, becoming part of the cultural mythology of many civilizations. This makes me reflect on how human experiences are, in many ways, timeless. In addition, there are records of floods in other parts of the world that could also have influenced these narratives. For example, in the Indus Valley, there are traces that suggest that great floods may have occurred, impacting the societies that developed there. However, what is striking is how these events, which may have happened in isolation, were, over time, intertwined into a common narrative, that of the flood. The idea that a cataclysmic event could serve as a watershed, both literally and figuratively, is a theme that resonates in many myths. 8. Cultural legacy. The legacy of the universal flood is something that permeates our daily lives, even if we often don't realize it. This myth is not just an ancient narrative. It becomes a reflection of human emotions and experiences that span generations. In literature, for example, we find references to the flood in classical and contemporary works, which use this powerful image of destruction and renewal to explore the human condition. It is fascinating how even without realizing it, many of us are touched by these ideas in different forms of art. The flood's influence extends beyond literature to music, film, and even the visual arts. In songs, we often find references to waters washing away sins or storms bringing renewal. These elements evoke a deep connection to the human experience of facing crises and emerging transformed. In films, the flood theme is often depicted as a metaphor for challenges that seem insurmountable but ultimately lead to a new beginning. This narrative resonates especially with those who have experienced hardship and sought new beginnings in their lives. Finally, as I reflect on the legacy of the Great Flood, I realize that it invites us to consider not only the destruction, but also the hope that emerges after adversity. Each of us, at some point in our lives, has faced our own storms, and just like the survivors in the myth, we have the ability to begin again, to reinvent ourselves, and to seek renewal in the midst of chaos. The Great Flood, therefore, is not just a story of tragedy, but a powerful narrative of resilience and renewal that continues to inspire and guide us. It is a reminder that, no matter the hardship, there is always the possibility of a new dawn.